Welcome. It's great to have all of you with us. This is the time we welcome everyone. And some of you may not even realize who we're welcoming. Right now, we're welcoming our classic service every Sunday at 9 o'clock down in the chapel. They have their own worship with some of the old hymns. I was able to lead worship down there this morning. What a great time we had. Now they're watching the sermon from here. We have our Sault Ste. Marie campus. And they also have live worship, live everything, but they watch the sermon from here, so we welcome them. Our church online campus from literally all over Michigan, all over the United States, and frankly all over the world who are watching right now. We welcome all of you. And we also welcome our many watch groups. Those are groups of people who meet together every Sunday for worship. They don't have a church, or they're a church without a pastor, and they use our service as their service. And there's a watch group meeting right now in Charlevoix. There's one in Harbor Springs, one on Bois Blanc Island. There's one down at the Tall Timber Church in Silver Springs, Florida, watching right now. And also, very, very, very soon, there'll be a watch group in Alpena as we get ready to launch our new campus. We're excited because we did this past week put an offer on a facility. We're waiting to hear what the response is to that. And if that response is favorable, we'll call a special meeting of the congregation, our membership, to be able to vote on approving that. So we're excited about all that God is doing. Now, with that in mind, you know that we have 6 catalysts for spiritual growth that we've identified here at E-Free Church, and we're emphasizing one a month. And for the month of February, which begins this week, we're emphasizing the catalyst of prayer. And we're going to be doing several things through the month, including beginning next Sunday, every service, there'll be an elder leading us in a time of prayer. But we've also have put together a prayer journal designed for the month of February that we would love for you to use to develop that daily discipline of prayer. Now, these are available on tables outside the auditoriums, in the back of the chapel, in the back up at the Sioux, also out in the hub. So if you would like one, please do pick one up and use those. And also keep in mind that we're very close now to Night to Shine. We have an enormous number of honored guests. It's a prom for individuals with special needs, and we still need a lot of buddies. And trust me, if you would commit to being a buddy for one of those honored guests that night, it'll be the greatest night of your life, I guarantee it. And so there's a table out in the hub, Night to Shine table. Go by that table and get some more information. All right, well, I'd like you to take your Bibles and open them to Acts 23, and we're going to continue our series we're calling The Long Road Home, as we continue following the life of Paul from the end of his 3rd missionary journey through the end of his life. Now, we get to a portion today, and we're going to be looking at Acts 23, 12 through 35, and it's an interesting portion because it doesn't seem to be theological. The name of God is not mentioned in today's passage. The name Jesus is not mentioned in today's passage. Paul does not preach. In fact, he just gives a one line. That's it. And when you read this passage from a bird's eye view, it appears to simply be narrative. It just appears to be, and here's what was going on between when Paul spoke here and when Paul spoke there. But we're going to see something I think is not just amazing, but very encouraging in this passage. We're going to see a wonderful example, maybe one of the best in the New Testament, on what we would call the providence of God. Now, what is the providence of God? Well, in our culture today, we call them coincidences, right? But we know, those who know Jesus, there's no such thing as coincidences. It's the providence of God. You see, the providence of God is the exact opposite of the miracles of God. The miracles of God, that's when God works outside the natural, right? Turning water into wine, that's not natural. Walking on water, that's not natural. Taking a little boy's lunch and multiplying it to feed thousands of people, that's not natural. Raising Lazarus from the dead, that's not natural. Miracles are when God works outside the natural. Providence is when God works using the natural. And even though miracles kind of get all the pop and circumstance, the truth is that the providence of God is every bit as exciting as the miracles of God. In fact, think about it this way. In the Bible, you see miracles, but you don't see miracles on every page. In fact, the majority of the chapters of the Bible do not include a miracle. Because in the Bible, miracles happened in 3 seasons. You had the seasons of Moses and Joshua, the parting of the Red Sea, the walls of Jericho falling down. And then there were no miracles, very few miracles, until you get to the time of Elijah and Elisha. Then you see many miracles as Elijah calls down fire from heaven and raises the widow's son back to life. And then there's a long season in the Bible where you see very few miracles until you get to the time of Jesus and the apostles. And then in AD 58, and we're going to see this in a few weeks, you see the last miracle recorded in the Bible. When a poisonous snake bites Paul, they wait for him to puff up like a balloon and pop, but he doesn't. There's not miracles on every chapter of the Bible. And the same is true in our lives. I mean, let's be honest. How many times in our life do we see God working outside the natural? Water turned into wine, that kind of stuff. The dead being raised, walking on water. Not often. But I can tell you this. You see the providence of God not only on every page in the Bible, you see the providence of God in every day of your life. And so we're going to see a great example today of the providence of God. How God works using the natural in order to get us where he wants us to be for his honor, for his glory, and to accomplish his purpose. Now, let me kind of catch you up, because in our ongoing narrative, there are 2 key individuals. There is, number 1, the commander of the Roman group that is stationed at the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem. His name is Claudius. He's over 1,000 men. They're there for one reason. Their goal, their job, is to ensure that during the Feast of Pentecost, there is no Jewish riot. And if a Jewish riot takes place, Claudius would lose his job, maybe even lose his life. Now, Claudius gets put in a very bad position, because the other main character is Paul, the Apostle Paul. And when Paul goes to the temple in Jerusalem during the Feast of Pentecost, a Jewish mob attacks him. They're literally beating him to death. That's not good for Claudius to see a riot. So Claudius rescues Paul. But Claudius realizes if he doesn't punish Paul, the Jews are going to riot. They want Paul dead. That's very clear in the passage. But Claudius does not know what crime he's committed. So Claudius decides, I need to find out what crime he committed so I can punish him. That'll satisfy the Jews. Everything will be okay. So he decides to beat a confession out of Paul. He literally strings him up, getting ready to scourge him. And right before he starts, Paul plays the card of saying, I'm a Roman citizen. Now that was important, because under Roman law, you could not punish a Roman citizen who had not been condemned. And up to this point, Paul had not been condemned. Claudius knew of no crime. If he punished Paul as a Roman citizen who wasn't condemned, he would break Roman law. And again, he would lose his position, maybe lose his life. So he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. Now, at the same time, you have the Apostle Paul. He's the victim. Every time Paul has opened his mouth to share Jesus, it ends in a riot. He is now very discouraged in the barracks. And we ended last week when Jesus appears to him and says to him, Paul, take courage. In the same way you proclaimed me in Jerusalem, you will also proclaim me in Rome. And that excited Paul, because Paul's greatest desire in ministry was to go to Rome and preach. So here's Paul in the barracks. He's feeling pretty good now. Claudius is in his room in the barracks going, I have no clue what to do. Enter the providence of God. So let me begin reading Acts 23, verse number 12. And it says this. When it was day, that would be the day after Jesus appears that night to Paul saying, take courage, you're going to go to Rome. When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath. And if you mark in your Bible, I'd underline that phrase. We're going to come back to it in a moment. It literally reads in the Greek, they anathematized themselves. Sounds a little painful, but we'll see what it is in a moment. Saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Now, there were more than 40 Jews who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests. Now, who are the chief priests? They're the Sadducees. They're the ones who are part of the Sanhedrin. They're the ones who hate Paul because Paul is preaching a resurrection and they don't believe in a resurrection. And they say to the chief priests and the elders, we have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now, you and the council, you and the rest of the Sanhedrin, here's what we want you to do. We want you to notify the commander, Claudius, to bring Paul down to you as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, we will be ready to slay Paul before he comes near this place. Now, keep something in mind. At this moment, Paul nor Claudius have any clue of this plot. Paul is feeling pretty good. Jesus just said, you're going to go to Rome. Claudius is distressed. How am I going to get out of this mess? And while they're doing that, early in the morning, these Jews form this plot. And the plot would be to have Claudius bring Paul back down, and they have an assassination group ready to strike. Now let's go back, though, to that phrase. It says they bound themselves under an oath. It literally reads in the Greek language, they anathematized themselves. Now, what does that mean? To anathematize yourself means that you are invoking a divine curse and judgment on your life if you don't do what you're claiming to do. Basically, here's what they would have said. Here's how this oath would have gone. They would have said, we will kill Paul, and may God kill us because we will not eat or drink until we kill Paul. They're invoking divine judgment upon themselves. It was very common in that day. In fact, if you remember the story of Elijah, after he calls down fire from heaven, and he has all the prophets of Baal killed, they go and they tell Queen Jezebel, a pagan, Elijah killed all the prophets of Baal. And what does she do? She anathematizes herself. She says, and may the gods kill me if I don't see Elijah dead by morning. That's what these Jewish people did. It's a word that means to invoke divine judgment. You can see this word in Galatians chapter 1, verse 8. Look at this. Paul says, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we preached, he is to be what? Accursed. He is to have divine judgment invoked on him. And so these Jews make this oath. Now, by the way, I think this is the kind of oath Jesus was referring to when he said, don't make an oath. Don't swear by an oath. Let your yes be yes and let your no be no. He's not saying it's wrong to say, so help me God in court. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, don't use this kind of invoking divine judgment. Don't use that kind of oath to prove your words are serious. You live the kind of life that people know your words are serious without having to take any kind of oath like that. But that's what these Jews do. So now we've got conflict brewing. Paul doesn't know about it. Claudius doesn't know about it. It seems like a good plan. It just might work. Except for the providence of God. And God is going to use the natural to make it happen. Look at verse number 16. But in contrast to the plot of the Jews, we have the providence of God. I love that, because that reminds me of something we see so often in the Bible, and it's this. Don't forget it. God is always working behind the scenes, even when it looks like evil is winning. These Jews think they've got it. They've got the foolproof plan. But God, in his providence, is working behind the scenes. And he now brings something into the equation completely out of left field. Look at it. But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and he entered the barracks and told Paul. Now let's stop there for a moment, because this comes out of left field. Why? Well, keep something in mind, that up until Acts 23, we have learned nothing at all about Paul's family, except that their headquarters was in Tarsus in the province of Cilicia. That's it. Through all of the narrative of Paul's life in the first 22 chapters of Acts, we learn nothing about his family. In all the writings he has done so far, we learn nothing of his family. In chapter 23, we learn two things about his family. If you remember last week, we learned something about his dad. Because Paul, in addressing the Sanhedrin, said, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. So the first thing we learn in the Bible about Paul's family is that Paul's dad was a Pharisee. And by the way, he was a staunch Pharisee. How do we know that? Because he's the one that sent Paul to a boarding school in Jerusalem to be schooled under the Rabbi Gamaliel in Pharisaical ways so that Paul could become a head Pharisee. So obviously his dad was a staunch Pharisee. Now think about it. What was the Pharisaical view of Jesus? Well, if you remember the life of Jesus, the harshest words he spoke on earth was directed towards Pharisees. Woe to you, you blind guides. Woe to you, you snakes and vipers. That's not how you win friends and influence people. Woe to you, you whitewashed walls. And as a result, the Pharisees hated Jesus, hated the teachings of Jesus, and hated anyone associated with Jesus. So let me ask you a question. How do you think Paul's dad responded when Paul, who he had sent to boarding school in Jerusalem to become a Pharisaical leader, how do you think his dad felt when Paul said, I am now a follower of Jesus Christ? You see, folks, the reason I think you never see mention of Paul's family is because it's my opinion, and please understand, this is thus saith Scott, not thus saith the Lord, but based on what I see in Scripture, I believe Paul's family disowned him. In fact, in the book of Philippians, Paul said, I have suffered the loss of all things for Jesus. And I think that included his family. But now we learn something else. Paulie had a sister, and she had a son. Uncle Paul is now Paul. Now, this brings up every kind of question imaginable to me. Why is his sister and nephew in Jerusalem? Well, I can give you a couple possibilities. I don't know the right answer. The possibilities would be, number one, she was bringing her son, Paul's nephew, to Jerusalem to do the same thing Paul had done. To be put in a boarding school and to be taught under the Pharisaical rabbis to become a Pharisaical leader to carry on the tradition that Uncle Paul messed up on. Or it could just be that they were there for the Feast of Pentecost. But do you really want to know the real reason Paul's sister and nephew were there that day? The providence of God. Do you see it? It's not a coincidence that God had his sister and his nephew there. And they're not just in Jerusalem. Somehow, some way, this nephew, who appears to be a young lad, I'll show you that in a moment, he ends up in a spot that morning where he overhears the ambush. That's not coincidence. That's God using the natural to orchestrate people's lives. Do you understand, my friends, that this very day, God is at work orchestrating other people's lives because he knows what's in your future? Think about it. That's exhilarating to me. So the nephew somehow hears about the plot. And he goes to the barracks and tells Paul. I know you might think, well, hey, say, if Paul's like a prisoner in the barracks, how can this little Jewish boy just go in and talk to him? Well, keep something in mind. Paul was a Roman citizen. He was being detained for his own well-being, but he wasn't being treated like a regular prisoner, because you couldn't do that to a Roman citizen who had not yet been condemned. So he's allowed visitors. And I'm sure the Roman guards are vetting them, and this lad comes up to the door and says, I am Paul's nephew. I need to talk to him. And they probably went and said, Paul, there's this little kid out here, and he says he's your nephew. He needs to talk to you. And Paul had to be like, whoa, I want to talk to him. I don't know how long it had been. Paul, depending on his age, may be going, I had no idea I had a nephew, you know? Yeah, send him in. So he goes in, he says, Paul, here's the plot. Now we see the only words Paul speaks in this passage. There's nothing theological to it. Here it is. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him. Now, again, let me just kind of remind you of something. We see the word centurion and the word commander. The commander was Claudius. A commander was over 1,000 Roman soldiers. Underneath the commander were 10 centurions, each one over 100 men. So he goes to one of the centurions, Paul does, and says, you need to take this lad to see Claudius. And what's remarkable to me is the centurion does. If you've studied at all about Roman history and the Roman army, it's not like they were really prone to do favors for Jewish people. Why does he do it? The providence of God. And so this centurion takes the lad to Claudius. Now here we see the providence of God again. Because I'm going to tell you right now, I stake a lot on this. I don't think there's many times that a commander in the Roman army would have given a hearing to a little Jewish boy that had something to say. So why is he open to listening to this little boy? Coincidence? No. The providence of God. So it says this. So the centurion took him and led him to the commander and said, Paul, the prisoner, by the way, basically through the rest of his life, that will be Paul's title. It's the first time we see Paul the prisoner, other than Paul calling himself a prisoner of Jesus. He will now be a prisoner basically the rest of his life. Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you since he has something to tell you. And here's this mighty commander. Leads 1,000 Roman soldiers. And look what it says. And the commander took him by the hand and stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, what is it that you have to report to me? Not only is God at work so that the commander would give this lad a hearing, but he actually shows a little bit of compassion. Do you see it? It's obviously this lad is nervous. I mean, he's heard stories about these Roman leaders. And the commander, Claudius, can tell he's nervous. So he kind of just takes him by the hand He says, come over here. Come over here. The providence of God. This is not the norm, folks. This is not the norm. He says, what do you have to tell me? And we see it. Verse 20. He said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow. They're going to do this tomorrow. To the council. As though they're going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. And I underlined the next phrase. And he looks at the commander, this little Jewish lad, and says, do not listen to them. Can you imagine? It's one thing that the commander would give this little Jewish lad a hearing, but now this little Jewish lad is telling the commander what to do. Folks, that's not the norm. This is the providence of God. He says, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. They're waiting. They're going to let you know this is what they want. They're waiting for you to make a promise then that you'll bring him down. Now look at verse 22. So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, tell no one that you've notified me of these things. Now, why does he tell him, tell no one? Because at this moment, Claudius has an idea. He knows exactly what he's going to do. And where do you think that idea came from? The providence of God. You can see God's fingerprints on every verse in this passage. Claudius knows exactly what to do. We'll see it in a second. Claudius is going to take Paul under the cover of night to Caesarea, 60 miles away, and say to Governor Felix, I need you to try this case. But he doesn't want these Jews to know he knows about their plot, because he wants to be able in the morning when they come to him and say, Claudius, we want you to bring Paul down for another hearing. He wants to be able to say, oh, guys, that is such a great idea. Only one problem. I already sent him to Felix. He's not here anymore. Sorry. This is Claudius' way of getting out of it. He will not be blamed by the Jews. And at the same time, he's not the one that has to punish Paul, a Roman citizen who is yet to be condemned. It's the providence of God. So notice what he does in verse 23. Claudius called to him 2 of the centurions. All right, pop quiz. How many Roman soldiers were under a centurion? 100. So if there's 2 centurions, how many Roman soldiers would be involved? 200. Very good. That's what it says. He called to him 2 of the centurions and said, get 200 soldiers, get them ready by the 3rd hour of the night. 3rd hour of the night, what's that? Well, keep in mind in that day, the day started at 6 in the morning and went till 6 at night. And night went from 6 p.m. to 6 in the morning. And so if it was the 3rd hour of the day, it would be 9 in the morning. If it was the 3rd hour of the night, it would be 9 o'clock at night. He's going to have them remove Paul under the cover of darkness. Keep reading. Get 200 soldiers ready by 9 o'clock to proceed to Caesarea. Now, Caesarea is about 60 miles from Jerusalem. Take with you also 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. A total of 470 soldiers to accompany one apostle. Do you not see the providence of God? Folks, when God wants you to be safe, he will make you safe. No doubt. You have the infantry, that's the soldiers. You have the cavalry, that's the horsemen. You have the artillery, that's the spearmen. They're all going, but notice this. And they were also to provide horses for Paul. You see, 400 of those Roman soldiers wouldn't have had a horse. Only the cavalry would have. They're all going to have to walk. Paul gets to ride a horse. Folks, when God sends you somewhere, he takes you first class. Here's Paul. He gets to ride the horse. Now, let's stop for a moment. Why is he going to take him to Caesarea? We'll see in a second. It's right there. It's because that's where Felix the governor is. We'll talk more about Felix next week. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But Felix is the replacement of Pontius Pilate. Remember him? Felix is his replacement. Why is he in Caesarea? Because that's where all the Roman dignitaries stayed. Caesarea was the headquarters in Judea of the Roman army, not Jerusalem. They only came to Jerusalem during feast times. Why Caesarea? If you've ever visited Caesarea, you know why. It's a beautiful port city on one of the most beautiful bodies of water I've ever seen, the Mediterranean Sea. And the Romans had a big palace built there. And the palace is extraordinary. The palace actually went all the way out into the Mediterranean Sea with a big swimming pool and everything else. The remains of it is still there today with artists' renditions of what it looked like. That was a whole lot nicer than staying in the Antonio fortress. So he's going to take him to Caesarea to Felix. Now, he's going to send with him a letter. And the letter is given to us verbatim, beginning in verse 25. And for the most part, the letter is just a rehearsing of what's happened. But I want you to notice it's not exactly 100% accurate. Look at it. And Claudius wrote a letter, and here's where we learn his name, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man, Paul, was arrested by the Jews and they were about to slay him, I came up. Claudius to the rescue. Man, he's making himself look good, isn't he? And he says this, I came up to them with the troops and I rescued him. And why did I rescue him? Because I had learned he was a Roman citizen and I was defending a Roman citizen. That, my friend, is a bunch of baloney. If you remember the story, he had no clue he was a Roman citizen at this point. He was about ready to scourge the man when he found out he was a Roman citizen. He's not being accurate. He realizes what he did to Paul could have been seen as a violation of Roman law. And do you know what he's trying to do? To put it in modern day vernacular, cover your ears, he was covering his butt. That's what he was doing. No doubt about it. Oh, yes, I rescued him because he was a Roman citizen. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving of death or imprisonment. I have found nothing wrong with him. Does this not remind you of a similar trial that happened about 25 years earlier? When Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, and 5 different times Pilate said, I find no fault in him. He said, verse 30, when I was informed that there would be a plot against him, I sent him to you at once. I did this. Listen, Felix, I'm not sending him to you to pass the buck, but to save his life. No, that's not really Claudius's motive, but he's making it seem that way. And I'm going to instruct his accusers to bring their charges to you. So the next morning when the Jews come and say, we'd like Paul, he can say, well, you know what, I'm sorry, I already sent him to be tried by Felix, so you need to go to Caesarea. You need to present your case against him to Felix. So, they take off. And notice in verse 31 what happens as we begin to wrap it up. So the soldiers, 470 strong, in accordance with their orders, took Paul, and they brought him by night. They left at 9 o'clock in the evening to kind of get out of town. Because, listen, back in that day, by 9 o'clock, not only were you all inside your houses, you were asleep. I could have lived in that day because I'm asleep by 9 o'clock every night. But they could get out of town without him knowing. So the soldiers went by night, and they went as far as Antiparis. And at Antiparis, they left the horsemen, 70 of them, the cavalry, to go with Paul to Caesarea. But the other 400, the 200 soldiers, 200 spearmen, they returned to Jerusalem. Now, Antipatris was a town located roughly halfway between Jerusalem and Caesarea. If you left Jerusalem to walk that way, the first 35 miles would be downhill. And when you got to the bottom, there would have been Antipatris. It was a stopover town that people used on their journeys back and forth to Jerusalem. Now, why did the Roman soldiers feel safe to just leave the 70 cavalry with Paul there for the rest of the journey? Because now they were out of Jewish territory. They were now in Gentile territory. The chance of a Jewish revolt here would be very, very slim. Verse 33. And when they had come to Caesarea, and they delivered the letter that Claudius wrote to Governor Felix, they also presented Paul to him. And when Felix had read the letter, he asked from what province Paul was from, and learned he was from Cilicia. Now, why did he ask that? Because he wanted to make sure Paul was in his jurisdiction. And Cilicia, that province, was in Felix's jurisdiction. So, verse 35, Felix said, I will give you a hearing, Paul, after your accusers have arrived. It's going to be a little bit till they get here. So Paul is taken and put in that palace. I'm sure he's not in a luxury suite in the palace, probably one of the lower rooms that weren't very fun. But that's where he will stay until his accusers show up and a trial could be had. Now I want you to think about something. Here's Paul. Basically, 24 hours earlier, Jesus said, take courage, Paul. You're not going to die in Jerusalem. You're going to go to Rome. And Paul's excited. But you know what's wild? He doesn't end up in Rome right away. He ends up in Caesarea. Do you know how long he will spend in Caesarea as a prisoner? About 2 full years. 2 full years he'll be there. Wondering, when am I going to Rome? God has a plan for your life. Through his providence, he will orchestrate your life to get you there. But understand this, folks. Often before you get there, there are times of waiting. You see a lot of times of waiting in the Bible. When the Jews left Egypt, left slavery, where was the destination? The promised land. Did they go right there? No. There was 40 years of waiting in the wilderness. You can back up to Moses after he had to flee Egypt because he killed the Egyptian. Before he goes back to Egypt as the deliverer of the Jews, there's 40 years of waiting as a shepherd in the wilderness. When Malachi the prophet gives us the last prediction about the coming Messiah and puts down his pen, it doesn't result in the Messiah immediately coming. There are 400 years of waiting. But here's what I want you to know. Because none of us like to wait. We want the rapid refund. We'll get in the express lane even if we have more than 20 items. You know you're guilty. We'll spend big bucks to go to the amusement park and then spend bigger bucks to get the pass to go to the front of the line. We don't like to wait. But I need you to know 2 things. Number 1, God is in your waiting. And it's in your times of waiting that you can best see his providence. Do you know what Paul will get to do over these 2 years? He will get to stand before Governor Felix and share Jesus. In fact, Felix will call Paul in for some private hearings to ask him more questions about Jesus. That wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the time of waiting. Felix will be replaced by a governor named Festus. Sounds like an old Western deputy to me, but Festus. And Festus will decide, I'm not going to release Paul. I'm not sure what's going on here. But Paul will have the opportunity to share Jesus with Festus, a Roman governor. And then, while still in Caesarea, Paul will have the opportunity to share Jesus to King Agrippa. To this day, you can go to Caesarea and sit in the amphitheater where that took place. You can see the spot down by the stage where Paul would have stood. You can see the level back up here in the stands where the king would have sat. And Paul would share with the king, and the king would say, Paul, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. Ladies and gentlemen, God is in the waiting. Don't despise the times of waiting. Don't be like the children of Israel in the wilderness and fill your time of waiting with complaints. Instead, look for the providence of God. Because even though you probably won't see a miracle of God every day of your life, you can see the providence of God as God works through the natural in your life and the life of others to get you where he wants you to be, even if it involves waiting for his honor and his glory. Trevor's going to take over up at the Sioux, and Doug Robinson's going to take over now down in the classic service. And here in the main auditorium, would you stand with me, please, for prayer? Father, I find it so exhilarating to know that you are already showing your providence in the lives of people around me, and maybe even people I've never met yet, because you know what's in my future. That's incredible. It's incredible for me to know that every day of my life, you are providentially involved. It's amazing to me to think that you would love me that much. And even though I may not see a miracle every day of my life, I can see your providence. And God, even when your providence takes me into times of waiting, help me to wait well, remembering that you are in the waiting. And you want to use the waiting in my life, not just the destination. God, I'm so thankful that in every page of my life, I can have the blessed assurance that Jesus is mine. And I pray this in his name. Amen. If you're a first-time guest with us, I'd love to connect with you. Would you take a card that's in front of you, fill it out, bring it out into what we call the hub when the service is over. My wife and I will be out there. We'd love to connect with you, give you a gift, meet you. We'd love to have you do that. Let's together worship a God who is in the waiting. And that's why we can have assurance.